one thing I want everyone to think about is that about 3/4 of the folks that become displaced end up becoming displaced for over 5 years. And 4 out of 5 of those people end up having to or end up staying in low income countries. And these are places where people are already struggling to meet their development goals and they are already vulnerable populations. So when there are climate change disasters, among other issues, there are particular issues with lack of resilience or lack of sufficient social systems. And if they're displaced for more than 5 years, it ends up becoming a systemic issue. But beyond that, we also want to consider that there are multiple factors that can incur people changing locations beyond just climate change. It may be their gender experience, their age, their location, their livelihood background. And we want to look today most specifically at the difference in risk management and household decisions and concerns and adaptations made by women, namely, and thinking about what these personal, more household characteristics might be and how that might be influencing their decision to either stay behind in their home location or to move into a state of displacement. So we have a wonderful lineup of speakers that I'm excited to introduce. We have a couple of videos as well, and in exact order, we're going to open with a video from Takeshi Kamino, who is our disaster risk resilience coordinator in CWS Japan. And followed by that, we'll be joined by Andrew Foyes, Senior Director of Global Migration of Church World Service, who will speak about a recent report done by Church World Service that he helped lead on climate adaptation and migration. We'll then be looking at a video about field experience that will complement the report discussion points by Titin Rejeki of Church World Service Indonesia. And then we'll have 2 additional panelists to speak of their expertise and experience. Swata Ibrahim, Head of Partnerships and Resource Development of the Kenya Red Cross Society. Swata has joined us last minute. Her colleague, Dr. Asha Mohammed, has unfortunately fallen ill. So we're very grateful Swata was able to step in and speak on behalf of the Kenya Red Cross Society. And she kindly is joining us from Nairobi. So thank you, Swata, for your time in that time zone today. And then our final speaker will bring us a very critical youth perspective. That's Serge Hampton, and he is a climate change and migration focal point of the Major Group for Children and Youth. And he is also based in Kenya. So we are very grateful to have 2 panelists joining us today in what should be their turn down for the evening. So without further ado, I would love to briefly introduce Takeshi so that I can play his video for you, which is a great opener to set the stage for this discussion and a little bit of background about forced displacement and the gender experiences. So Takeshi heads CWS Japan. He also serves as the co-chairperson of the Japan Platform, the executive committee for the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network, and joint secretariat of Japan CSO Coalition for Disaster Risk Reduction. He has worked extensively in humanitarian emergency response, as well as disaster risk reduction in the Asia region, including in response to various crises in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, India, Philippines, and Japan. So without further ado, I am pleased to share with you this wonderful video done by Takeshi.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Takeshi Kamino from Church World Service Japan office. In this important occasion of the Commission on the Status of Women, I would like to share a few of my thoughts with policy implications around forced displacement and gender aspects. First of all, we all know that there are various forms of migration, some voluntary and some forced. In the Asian region where I work, out of 19 million migrants, around 58% are men, around 42% are comprised by women. There are also many who are not being recorded due to their unofficial status. The number of those who are displaced by force are at its height at the moment, often choosing the migration option as the last resort. There are 3 aspects around policy implication of gender side of forced migration by climate change that I would like to share. First, many rural communities rely on subsistence farming and women and girls play an important role in securing water, food, and household resources. Whether we like it or not, that is a reality for many currently. Forced migration will take such resources and environment away and affect significantly to vulnerability of women and girls. Migration in such contexts is not simply changing physical locations, but has a great consequences in deteriorating vulnerabilities, which often requires protection initiatives by the authorities or host communities. It also leads to increasing gender-based violence, and it is not an easy thing for those who face with such situation to report and correct, as they don't have effective protection means. Second, many women and girls are subject to sometimes harmful socio-cultural norms, such as restricted livelihood options, access to safety nets, education disparities as compared to men. Migration itself is a coping mechanism for significant levels of shocks and stresses, but this coping mechanism often deteriorate the living conditions of those who flee from such risks. So oftentimes, forced migration make them more vulnerable with reduced social capital that they have had in their communities. Lastly, we say that disaster risk is a combination of exposure to hazard, vulnerabilities, and capacities of those who face such hazard. As I've explained, forced migration deteriorates both vulnerabilities and capacity of those who migrate. And due to the climate change impact, we are living in the era that 1 in 5 people will face disasters in their lifetime, which shows a significant increase in the exposure to hazard in the current context of climate change. As people face more disasters, the coping capacity is deteriorating, particularly those vulnerable communities who don't have mitigation means and any other options. Although the situation seems bleak after saying all this, I also see signs of hope. As all of you are gathering for this event, there are growing focus on the role of women, the leadership of women in the health of communities in this changing time. I have personally witnessed many of such cases. For example, there were mothers in southern Myanmar who completely changed the nutritional status of children in their village by self-organizing competition on healthy food with what they grow in their communities. Women leaders in Southeast Pakistan have shown that their leadership in social protection and solidarity among the villagers in severely drought-affected time lead to enhanced coping capacity as a village. As such, in many of the Asian countries where I've been, women have always been the change agents in their societies, but often their leadership were taken for granted. But it is time that we recognize and support their leadership, be it at the household level, communal level, or wider political and social levels. The leadership of women cannot be underestimated. After the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, we are moving towards localization trend. And it is a common understanding now that we need to support local leadership to overcome the ever-increasing disaster risks. And this links directly to why we need to support women's leadership in social transformation. There are many things we can do further, and I suggest that we look at it one by one and realize them towards a healthier society, overcoming the ever-increasing risks that we face so that no one is left behind. Thank you.
We are very grateful that Takeshi was able to share that wonderful video with us and show us some very shocking and sobering images of what people are experiencing and what creates a lot of the challenges and environments and circumstances that push people into forced displacement. I would like now to turn to Andrew Foyce, who will speak a bit about the climate adaptation and migration report I mentioned earlier. Andrew supports the CWS mission to transform communities around the globe through just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. In his current role as Senior Director of Global Migration, Andrew he does in his current role. But before joining CWS, Andrew worked as a policy officer in 2008 and Asian focal point for the International Land Coalition, which is a global alliance to increase secure access to land by resource-poor families and communities. And he was a program officer with the National Democratic Institute, the Asia Division. He currently serves on the advisory board for QDEP, which is a community-based organization in New York that assists LGBTIQ plus and HIV plus asylum seekers and other immigrants. And Andrew also holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of California. Andrew, without further ado, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mary Kate. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us from many different corners of the world. My name is Andrew. I work with Church World Service covering global migration. And as an organization of faith, Church World Service believes that all people deserve to live lives with dignity wherever we find ourselves. And that's becoming increasingly important for us to bear in mind as more and more people are on the move for a variety of reasons. We also believe that creation is sacred and that we're called to responsibly steward its gifts to us. And for this reason, I think we were drawn towards looking at how mobility and climate intersected in places where CWS is already working alongside community partners to try to increase resources available for climate adaptation, for resilient livelihoods, and for disaster risk reduction. Last year, we conducted a 5-country study looking at perceptions towards climate change, in-place adaptation, and migration in communities where we support adaptation and disaster risk reduction. We did this in Cambodia, Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, and Georgia. It was a community-involved project, I think, not necessarily a community-driven form of research, but we used qualitative methods and engaged with our community partners to define the interview tool, the focus group discussions. And at the end, we did a report back session to present the preliminary findings and discuss what we could make of the findings towards recommendations. And I think that's the point where we were able to bring in members of the communities, men and women who live in the places where we're active, to really give us some suggestions on what needs to come next, both in terms of ensuring access to resources for adaptation and also making migration something safer, more productive for people who are on the move. Across the board, the study reaffirmed that climate change is very much felt in people's lives. Changing seasonal patterns, changing rainfall patterns, increasing water scarcity were common themes. A lot of the places where we're working, where we did the study, are in arid or semi-arid areas where even slight changes in rainfall can have huge effects. The slow onset climate impacts are contributing to forms of human insecurity, including food insecurity in several locations. In one location, we heard it described almost the same wording that we would hear somebody describe a persecution claim, describing hunger is trying to kill me, and this is the reason that I had to leave. We're also hearing increasing risks of sudden disasters, as my colleague Takeshi shared in his video, floods, landslides, storms. These are concerns not only because of the increasing risk they pose for displacement, but also because of longer term impacts on agricultural production and on the environment where people are living. Local adaptation is becoming increasingly difficult as the climate conditions are growing harsher. One Indonesian farmer described it to us as needing to work 3 times as hard just to get the same yield as maybe a few decades ago. A few of the observations that we had related to gender, we didn't focus specifically on gender, but we did try to look at what were some of the patterns or trends in the responses, comparing what we were hearing from women, what we were hearing from men, as well as making comparisons across different age groups. In Georgia, one thing that came out was the gender roles particularly in communities of origin. So we were hearing that as people are moving, the effects of women migrating, whether it's from a rural area to a city or moving outside of the country into other countries in Europe, there seemed to be a lot of concerns about the impacts on the family and particularly the impacts on youth. And people were making a correlation between migration of women and increase of street children, less supervision of youth, which was something we didn't hear in Cambodia, where there are also women who are migrating away from the communities where we did the study. But there, partly it seemed that there was a bit more of a division of labor and roles within the household, where as women were leaving, those were not the same sort of concerns that we were hearing. So I think one thing that bears in mind is to have attention to the way that gender roles exist, affect families, and as women are on the move, to be able to incorporate responses in places of origin that account for the many different, not just economic functions, but social functions, cultural functions, family leadership that women are providing. We'll hear a little bit from a video from my colleague Titin in Indonesia. One thing that struck me from the study there was how long distance migration was gendered in the communities where we're working. Most people are moving in relation to climate closer to home, so moving maybe one county over, one district over. But for the few people who were describing longer term migration, it was women who were more likely to be traveling outside of the country and going through bilateral labor migration programs, going to work in other countries, whereas men were more likely to be moving to other islands, other provinces. Both men and women working through labor migration facilitated programs where they have contacts with employers or through agents before deciding to migrate. But because women are more likely to be traveling across borders, there's also heightened risks that women will face in long distance migration in those contexts. And it really bears the importance of having protection structures in place that women who are migrating through labor migration schemes can have to call on in case they find themselves in difficult situations with their employers or other points in the migration experience. In Cambodia, since we've done the study there, we've been investing in adaptive livelihoods to support families to have access to resources, especially for gardening. As the conditions grow drier in the part of Cambodia where we're working, there needs to be more investment in resilient agriculture, resilient supplies for gardening, and also improving access to water supplies. We've already heard one small success story from this from one woman who's participating in our activities, who is telling us that as she's been able to improve her skills in organic farming, be able to access marketplaces to sell her products, it's increasing income for the family. And now this means that her husband has more options. He had been a migrant day laborer working within Cambodia, but in towns and cities further away from home, often facing unfair labor practices, risks that he might not get paid for his work. So since she's been able to improve access to income, this has allowed him more flexibility to decide how he'll spend his time. And he's now choosing it to support her in her business. So rather than traveling away from his family for uncertain work opportunities, she now has his support at home. In her words, he does not need to leave home for work. Instead, he can help me working on our vegetable garden, from which we earn much better income. We will use some of the savings to expand our business and to continue to support our kids' schooling. Meanwhile, in Kenya, the area where we did our study in Kitui County, like much of the country, has been suffering through a really long drought period, I think for the past year now. We've been hearing there that men are more likely to be leaving because of the drought, which even further increases the household management responsibilities to women. As Takeshi mentioned in the intro, women are already responsible for many of the aspects of household life, including water management, including in many cases farming, ensuring that there's access to food for the family. As more and more men are traveling to towns and cities in the times of drought, this is further increasing the household responsibilities and leadership roles that women are taking. I think we've heard there, both through the study and through our ongoing work with communities, that women are quite active in community associations. They're quite active in the kinds of adaptation support programs that CWS provides. One reason that activities succeed is because women have an opportunity to take decisions, to give leadership on matters that affect themselves and their family. We've heard from many women in our project area that climate change and resilience is a great concern. And this points, I think, to the need to ensure that as organizing and advocacy takes place, to try to connect the resources that are being made available for adaptation and risk reduction with communities that are experiencing drought or experiencing other forms of climate change, that women need to be at the table and need to be voicing what are the priorities, what are the kinds of concerns, what are the opportunities. In this part of Kenya, we've heard recommendations from women's groups to invest in fruit tree production, to improve the kinds of post-production, post-harvest technologies that are available, and that this can help increase income opportunities and ensure better nutrition for their families in between the rainy periods. In all of the locations where we did the study, we heard a strong desire for climate adaptation to succeed. We also heard that in most places, people are already putting the resources that they have towards adapting or towards coping in a sense. And that in many cases, it's women and women-led associations that are mobilizing those resources. This echoes, in a sense, what we heard last year in November at the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, where climate vulnerable countries were raising up the point that people who are already feeling most acutely climate change are first adapters. That's using the term from the head of ECAD in Bangladesh. And I really like that term. First adapters, people who are already putting what resources they have towards coping, and it's really now in the hands of other governments, other movements, particularly in countries where most of the carbon emissions have been produced, to be able to bring resources to complement what people who are feeling climate change are already doing. So that's something I think we need to bear in mind, and also ensure that at the global summits, like the next COP that's taking place this year in Egypt, that women and women-led associations are taking part and are lifting up what are the skills, what are the strengths, what are the resources that they are already mobilizing in response to climate change, and what needs to be brought to bear by other governments, including governments that have a responsibility to take action. In places where we heard migration described as a coping strategy, like Cambodia, Georgia, Haiti, we heard often a demand, not necessarily for material resources or financial resources or technology, but for information, for more information about what opportunities are available, what are the ways to move safely if moving across borders, to move through regular channels. People who responded to our study tended not to describe it in terms of wanting to be convinced to move or not to move, which is unfortunately, I think, the frame that many information programs can take, but rather just to have access to reliable sources of information, to understand the risk, or even to just have a space to make sense of risks that they're already aware of, and to be able to weigh many options, none of which are perfect, all of which have risks. And to be able to assist themselves and their families in making those difficult decisions. And of course, we were called upon to bring more resources to bear so that the adapting in place isn't as risky as it already is. And so in places where migration may be a viable option, a safe option, that's something that can be more easily considered, but where it is an option that puts people in harm's way potentially, you have safer options to stay in place. But certainly we also heard that migration needs to be made safer, more affordable, more accessible, and that these are issues that need to be brought up later this year in the International Migration Review Forum that's taking place this May, and also similarly as with the need for women's voices to be part of the climate process. Women both on the move and women in communities that are feeling the brunt of climate change should and must be part of the discussions in New York and virtually in May to consider what are options with migration going forward. So I'll stop there and leave those two thoughts for the audience, and we'll be very happy to take questions and hear comments when we get to the discussion point. And finally, I'll drop into the chat a link to the CWS report. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was such a great snapshot of this very robust report that CWS had put out. And I definitely think that you're giving us some very important insights that we can leave with some understanding of the reasons for the gaps in poor climate adaptation and what these effects are in forced displacement. And of course, you talked about some of the inevitable harms linked to climate change. It's very fascinating to learn that people are in some areas working 3 times as hard for similar yield that they would have had years ago. So these are important things to think of. Before we move on to Titian's video, I had one quick question for you. You know, you made a very important note that there was significant feedback from folks that they not only did not want to feel forced to migrate, but also didn't want to necessarily feel forced to stay. And that definitely highlights the necessary right to migration, and also people's choice in staying where they live, or also in moving if they so wish to do so. Can you talk a little bit, or just give us even just two simple examples of what resources or climate adaptation resilience looked like for being able to adapt in place? Maybe just two quick examples to give us a picture of what that looks like when people are able to stay and choose to stay where they've been living.
Yeah, and I'll mention just to give some context. If you have a chance to read the report for folks in the virtual room, in the introduction we provide a brief scan of literature on climate as it relates to migration, and we took as the standpoint the idea that forced and voluntary is a continuum, and that there's a lot of different factors that may lead somebody to move. Climate is one factor, but it's not the only factor, and some of it can be related to the environment that you're in, your social context, political context, but also just individual and family characteristics. I would say most of what we heard, I would characterize as reluctant migration. So people who described being on the move or considering to be on the move as something that it was a choice. It was not something that they felt necessarily that they were being forced into, but it was a choice it was a difficult option among many other poor options. There were a few places where we did hear, I think it expressed in terms of, I would almost say a tipping point for displacement. One community in Haiti that's facing sea level rise. It's an island community on top of the droughts, on top of other impacts of climate change, on top of other pressures that the community is facing. And the way we heard it in the focus group there was, this is the final straw, that if we now are losing the ability to make a go of it because of these climate impacts over time, this is what's going to force us to move. I think one example from our work in Cambodia has been to improve the canal infrastructure that is, I think, relatively extensive, but has been very poorly maintained. There hasn't been a lot of investment in the canal infrastructure, at least in the part of the country where we've been working. And so water scarcity has already been a challenge. As the conditions start growing hotter, growing drier, as rainfall becomes more unpredictable, improving access to water in a way that could be accessed by a broader spectrum of the public is something that we were called upon to partner with the communities that we met in the study and that we've been working alongside. So I think that's one specific example. One other example that I'll share from Kenya, I think, was improving some sort of safety net in the times of drought. And so I think people recognize that the conditions are growing very difficult for farming, for raising livestock. And while there's a lot of energy, I would say, for investing in new livelihoods that are more adaptive, there's also the reality that the drought conditions are just growing extreme enough, and so extreme in some of the communities where we're working, that we need to have some ways to ensure access to food and other basic supplies in times of extreme need. So I think thinking more about early warning systems, thinking about pre-positioning those types of emergency supplies, and how to work with communities to be able to anticipate those and be able to voice what they're feeling in terms of changes in the weather and its impact to the audiences that can take action, like the county governments and other duty bearers.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's wonderful. I did see a question from Brian. In the interest of just making sure that T-Teen's video is able to do a ideal and complementary follow-up to Andrew's video, I'm going to play the video from T-Teen, and then Brian, I'll come to you for your question, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. That way your relevance to the report still stays with our discussion, Brian. So I did see that. Thank you. I'm going to present T-Teen now as well. T-Teen is a program manager with CWS Indonesia, and she has extensive research and community development experience. And she has actually been CWS's lead researcher in Indonesia for the climate adaptation and migration study. So looking forward to showing you her video that will discuss some of the latest field experience in Indonesia.
Hi, my name is Titin Rezeki, Senior Program Advisor to World Service Indonesia. I would like to share our project's experience related women, climate change, and migration. Our projects are Dream 2 in Central Sulawesi and Timur Hanggar in East Nusa Tenggara, Indonesia. As we know that the climate change greatly impact farmers who really dependent in the climates. So in this situation, women are the most vulnerable group who feel the most impact of climate change. In rural area, women usually have responsibility for the household, water, energy, and food supply. So when the crop failure occurs, it is women who helter-skelter manage the impact, how to continue children educational need fulfilled, and how to continue provide food for her family. So decline crop yield every year and overview of the food insecurity have motivated men and women in villages to see migration as an option. In our last research in Central Sulawesi, we found that men have mostly migrated to the nearby village or to the provincial capital to work. And some women also work overseas as a migrant worker. Similar happened in East Nusa Tenggara. Some women also work abroad as a migrant worker, mostly in the domestic help sector. The fact that the migration had been chosen as an answer for the climate change pressure should have received a serious attention from us, NGO, government, and other stakeholders. The prospective migrant workers should be equipped with the sufficient skill, can be language skill or the skill, specific skill related to their works. And the most important things, the migrant workers should know all the relevant legal instrument that can protect them from the human trafficking and other injustice. We need to advocate governments to make sure that all the instrument, legal instrument and policy really work in the field. Besides the migration, we also aware that some women stay in their village because they have to taking care of their children, their elderly parents, and their farm and their land. We need to support women who choose adaptation in place. In Palu, for example, women take effort in resilience, climate change resilience through forming the saving and loan groups. The saving prepare to deal with the crop failures. In East Nusa Tenggara also similar happened. Women are form the saving and loan groups and making the business group such as group productions, weaving, and savings group. The income from this business can support them to fulfill the need in their family. So whatever the form of climate change adaptation have been chosen by women, either adaptation in place or the migration, we need to support them because women is our front line in the climate change adaptation. They are not the passive victims. They are adapting and developing community resilience. Key contribution of women is to preserve nature and civilization. So we need to rehabilitate women's rights over the land, nature, and food. So we need to support women to get their right. Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear the field perspective. And before we move on to Swata, Brian, I will let you have the floor to ask your quick question to Andrew, since it seems to have direct relevance to his remarks on the report, if you're still there. May or may not be, though. I know his camera is now off.
Mary Kate, I
You
see.
want me to-
I think Brian's put his question in the chat.
Oh, we did. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Or Brian, or if you're there, you could speak it out loud.
If not, and there may be, another thing he has to do. So I'm happy to read the question. It states, in our country, Kenya is dealing with drought that has overwhelmed people living in areas that are drought hit, and people are dying every day of hunger, and there's no one paying attention to the disaster. What should people do in order to cope with the situation? So I guess, do you have a quick example that could be shared?
Yeah, I mean, one thought related to this question also from the study that we did and the people we spoke with, I think we got the sense that out of all the 5 locations, Kenya and Kitui County is where we did the study. There was the greatest risk that people didn't have migration as a safety valve in times of environmental crisis. And I think that's part of what we've been unfortunately having to respond to this year. But by that I mean that many of the people described it in even people who had experience moving to Nairobi or other towns before described it as a very hard experience. It didn't sound like that there was a lot of positive, some positive, but also a lot of negative experiences in terms of being able to find work, being able to support one's family. I think a lot of people felt the family separation very acutely. And so it was where it seemed least viable that mobility could be an option, even just as a coping mechanism. And that's something to bear in mind, I think, in places where unfortunately the climate predictions may be pointing towards drought occurring more regularly, more severely. On the one hand, there needs to be anticipation of the humanitarian needs. We heard people and families skipping meals, going hungry. Really, I think it was probably the most difficult examples from the 5 places where we did our study. So for there to be some response to those needs as they're felt and voiced, but also I think to be able to see why is it that migration is not working for some people, and are there ways that policies could be shaped that could anticipate that maybe mobility will be something more and more people will need to consider, or will want to consider if they had a better way of moving and making a go of it. This is a really challenging topic, not just I think in what I've been learning in many places around the world, including here in the US, in part because local government officials are typically want people in their community to stay in their community, and they want to see investments, and they want to see life and flourishing. So it's a very hard and challenging subject to bring up, but I think it's one that as climate change continues to take its toll and have its impacts, it's going to need to be discussed a bit more, and in ways where communities that are feeling the impacts are the ones who can sort of shape and drive that discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's very helpful. All right. So moving to our next speaker, we have Swata Ibrahim, who is the head of partnerships and resource development at Kenya Red Cross Society. Swata has over 14 years of experience working in the humanitarian and development field. Prior to her role in partnerships, she actually served as the disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation manager at the Kenya Red Cross. And she holds a master's degree in disaster management and a bachelor's in sociology and political science. So we are looking forward to hearing her remarks from her experience working with Kenya Red Cross Society. Swata, you have the floor.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me and also the Red Cross as part of the conversation. Maybe a little bit of background. The Red Crescent movement, I think I would say, is one of the world's largest humanitarian network. We are currently present in 192 countries, and our secretariat being the IFRC based in Geneva. And our work is mainly supported by volunteers, currently 14 million volunteers around the world. So we work before, during, and after disasters to support communities who are vulnerable in times of need, but also in terms of long-term resilience for those communities. So I think in the discussion today, allow me to start with some statistics from a report that has been done by the Federation IFRC Displacement Report that in 2020, we had 30.7 million people who are internally displaced by disasters, which is over 3 times more than conflict and violence. And of those who are displaced, 98% was mainly because of weather and climate hazard. In addition to that, as per our IFRC World Disaster Report 2020, it also notes that 83% of all disasters in the last decade were caused by climate and weather related, impacting 1.7 billion people around the world. IFRC's report on the cost of doing nothing also indicates or predicts that by 2050, 200 million people will need humanitarian assistance if nothing is done now. So just to show the gravity of the situation in relation to climate change and the need to quickly adapt to the changing climate. Coming back home here to Kenya, climate change and climate-related disasters such as floods and drought have now replaced inter-ethnic conflict as the main reason people are now being internally displaced. I would say on an annual basis, we have around approximately 80,000 people who are displaced from their homes, whether temporarily or permanently. As we speak now, we have people who have been displaced from the year 2020, when we experienced flooding due to backflow in Lake Victoria in Western Kenya that led to the destruction of homes, crops, livestock, and assets. So this population of IDPs are yet to be resettled and being hosted by different parties in their communities, but some were never able to return to their homes. We are also seeing climate migration due to drought that has been triggered by secondary aspects such as food insecurity and resource-based conflict. And we are equally seeing migration from border countries due to the regional nature of some of the disasters. Currently, we're experiencing the Horn of Africa drought. So it's not only in Kenya, but also Somalia and Ethiopia, where in Kenya, we have 3.1 million people who are affected and in dire need of support. So the situation is further compounded for women and girls, particularly in these marginalized communities. This is mainly because of the systemic gender inequalities present in our communities, in leadership and in decision-making, which limits access to resources and inhibits the ability of women and girls to withstand the impacts of climate change and access basic services to recover from climate-related disasters. Women who are displaced during these particular disasters, of course, face different impacts. For example, there are increased protection risks, such as sexual and gender-based violence, exploitation. They have limited access to healthcare, which impedes their access to life-saving health services, and also issues around mental health during the periods of displacement. The exposure to violence, the loss of social support networks, and the heavy caregiving burdens increases aspects such as anxiety, post-traumatic stresses, and other illnesses during periods of displacement. So as Kenya Red Cross, also being a humanitarian relief organization, we also intervene supporting communities during these periods of displacement. Services we provide include providing shelter, temporary shelter, relief items, including food, dignity kits for groups such as men and women during that time, protection services like admission, SGBV, and issues around domestic violence increase in such instances, and also mental health and psychosocial support, and continuous assessment of the people at risk, especially for women, children, older persons, and persons living with disability. The response initiatives integrate a gender lens to ensure that we do no harm to these vulnerable groups. So when we do shelter, for example, infrastructure, we ensure that we take into account, where women are staying. When we're doing water points or latrine points, we're also constructing them in a manner that will enhance safety. And also when we're providing the dignity kits, we ensure that women are also are also taken care of in terms of menstrual health hygiene, health provision. But we also look at establishing complaints and feedback mechanisms to ensure that we're able to support the communities in the way they need. The ability of women and girls to adapt, we have seen that they're challenged, again, due to the sociocultural norms, the restricted livelihood options, the lack of access to formalized safety nets, and fewer possibilities to benefit from technology and information. So even during disasters, women lack, for example, the technology, the phones, their access to radio to even receive the early warning information that can be able to prevent them from the disaster risks. Other impacts have included increased hardships due to their lack of financial assets and limited rights to land and property. We are also seeing migration as a coping strategy, being gendered, because it will require physical mobility, but also the economic and the physical capacity that are not equally available to women. So in most cases, we've seen, especially for the pastoral communities, women and children are left behind while men seek opportunities either in the urban areas, while also moving with their livestock during the drought period. In addition, we've also seen mushrooming small villages, especially for communities where we have pastoralist dropout in the peripheries of, in urban areas. As a result of these communities, or women and girls have also adopted negative coping mechanisms, for example, early marriages to ensure that their households acquire assets, for example, as part of dowry, so that they're able to cope. Women and girls' participation and empowerment is key to addressing disaster displacement and its harmful outcomes. And as the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we continue to support initiatives that put women and girls at the center to find solutions on climate adaptation. We support initiatives around inclusion and leadership of women. We support women to participate in decision-making platforms in their communities. We support capacity building programs, and we also look at engaging women to contribute to policies, whether around disaster risk management or climate change adaptation. We support economic empowerment programs that support women to engage in economic opportunities that are more climate adaptive. So like climate smart agricultural practices, conservation agriculture, supporting women in village saving loan associations, and also to attend, for example, vocational training so that they're not reliant on mainly nature, sort of like natural resource initiatives as part of their livelihood. We also support mental health and psychosocial well-being. As the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, again, we have developed guidelines for mental health and psychosocial support during migration and displacement, because I think this is also something that is very key and sometimes overlooked. So in summary, I'll say that is how we looked at the whole aspect or the intersectionality of gender and climate adaptation and displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swata. It's wonderful to hear about all the great things that Kenya Red Cross Society is carrying out. And I think you made very poignant remarks about the mental health issues too, especially that are faced by girls and women, and the PTSD and anxiety, the GBV, and the important work that the Kenya Red Cross Society is doing to hopefully help prevent GBV and other issues like that, but also be a resource for those that experience that. You also mentioned something interesting. We heard from Andrew, migration as a coping mechanism, and then we talked a little bit about migration not being a choice for all people. Or an option. And then you were able to talk a little bit about the negative coping mechanisms that people have to turn to, like early child marriage, just to gain access to assets and whatnot. I'm curious if you can just speak a little bit about how, like an example of where the Kenya Red Cross Society has been able to get them involved in more local decision-making and economic empowerment, what difference that makes either statistically or as an example in them being able to avoid those negative coping mechanisms in cases of climate change and displacement.
Yeah, so I would say like specifically around policy engagement, we support a number of county governments to develop disaster risk management policies. So just by ensuring that we're able to mobilize and have women from the grassroots level participate, for example, in risk identification, looking at the gender impact of disasters in their communities, I think that already itself is a platform to ensure that some of the responses or initiatives that take care of the impacts for women and girls differently are included in the policy discussion. So we are able to support them to access those particular platforms, support in getting the ideas to ensure that they're drafted into some of these key documents at the county government level. So sometimes it seems that it's so obvious that these things will be included, but more often than not, these are things that are normally missed out or forgotten in some of these particular discussions. So it's very important to have them sit at the table. In terms of supporting women, like I think it has been mentioned several that women are more engaged around natural resource management. They're the ones who take care, ensure food security at the household level, ensure that there's water at the house, ensure that there's energy in the source of firewood, etc. So they're not really, in a sense, be able to engage in initiatives or even look at that they would have, for example, particular expertise or knowledge around management of natural resource. So ensuring that they're able to participate and contribute in their communities with climate-smart agricultural practices. We've seen that when women are engaged, they pick up more. And some of these, practices such as conservation agriculture are able to be taken up more. So I think all the better to be able to engage them in terms of finding solutions rather than seeing women as more victims or being more vulnerable during such climate disasters.
Thank you so much for that, Swata. We had Regine had their hand up before. Regine, I'd be happy to give you the floor right now. While Regine poses their question, I wanted to also welcome our attendees to take a moment when you're able to please in the chat, just type in your name, your position, your affiliation, and also your location. We love to know the breadth of where our participants are coming in from. So we'd appreciate that. Regine, I will hand the floor to you.
Hi, can you hear and see me okay? Okay, I do have a comment and question. So I just want to comment, and it goes based off of what Andrew was saying before. In terms of accessibility and what we're seeing now with climate migrants, is that another barrier that they face is that they may not necessarily have accessibility to the resources because they're not citizens of that country, because when they get to other countries, for example, is that they may be considered to be stateless. So how are they able to, like, what can governments do, right, in order to give these people that are coming in like some kind of a status where they would be able to recognize these resources, because they faced a whole host of challenges as a lot of what was discovered already is like they health, language barriers, things like that. And another question that I have is, in countries where new phenomenons of climate is starting to uphold, how does that happen in terms of policy? Because I live in Canada and there's a province where it's like California, and the government doesn't necessarily know how to enact right now a climate policy for that particular province because of the fluctuating effects and types of climate that has been happening. Because this is specifically British Columbia, where they, over the last, from summer to now, they had a lot of forest fires. Like they had a heat wave, a massive heat wave, and then it sparked all this forest fires because of the heat. And then they had, from that, it rained, and they ended up getting like a month worth of rain, like over a short period of time. And then they had a blizzard with snow. So there's challenges there as well, but I don't want to take too much time. So if we could just like generally, that's what I wanted to point out.
Thank you, Regine. Those are wonderful questions. Swata, would you be comfortable answering those based on your experience and your background as well?
Sorry, I missed, my connection was a bit erratic. I missed some of the points. Happy to check them on if they can still be on the chat. Yeah.
Sure. Regina, if you want to just take one moment to maybe summarize the question in just one or two more sentences, and if you also need to.
Okay, I was saying that what can governments do for climate migrants that are going into other countries where they're not necessarily considered citizens because they're considered stateless, and so they may not necessarily be able to access the resources. So what can governments do in order to kind of help alleviate the challenges so that these climate migrants will be able to access them? And the other question that I had was, in countries that are starting to see new phenomena of climate change, where it's so sporadic, how can governments be able to impact policies to kind of prevent climate change where it's relatively new? Like I was given the instance of a province in Canada where they've had like 4 different instances of weather patterns, and the government can't really enact anything for prevention because it's relatively new. Does that kind of help? Did I summarize it okay?
Yeah, maybe I can take the first one because I think in Kenya we're more familiar with it in terms of the climate, we say climate refugees. And I think in 2011, when we had one of the most severe droughts in the Horn of Africa, we had people coming from Somalia into Kenya. And in that particular, I mean, it's quite tricky with the government. We are used to people fleeing conflict coming into the country. So coming in where we're saying that there's drought in Somalia and people are coming to Kenya so that they can able to access aid in terms of food and water over this side was a bit, I think, of I would say like a first time situation. And how it was handled at that particular time, it was them joining, for example, some of the refugee camps that are established in Kenya. So in Kenya, we have, I think, one of the largest refugee camps in Dadaab. So you'd find that they would trickle in the camp to be able to get that particular support. And then after the drought, then they would, be sort of like deregistered and then move on back to Somalia. So in this particular drought now, again in 2022, we're in another drought situation. We're also seeing similar refugees trickling in. However, the stand of the government is that we are not registering refugees in that particular stance. And of course, Kenya again has announced that it's in the process of closing its camp and not accepting refugees. So it's quite challenging when we are trying to reduce the number of refugees from climate and looking at durable solutions to support them. And then now the aspect of having more people trickling in from climate, and I think it's still a gray area whereby we are not really sure on how to handle such situations. So from the Kenyan experience, that's what I can share.
Okay.
Thank you, Swata. Andrew, did you have any comments, especially on the issue of statelessness or undocumented individuals and their access to resources and employment, et cetera?
Yeah, I can, a couple points. One is that there is efforts definitely by civil society networks, climate justice and migrant justice coalitions to sort of increase the call for safe pathways, safe migration pathways for people who are impacted by climate change and who are moving across borders. It's within the research community, it's sort of accepted, it's conventional wisdom that most climate related migration is shorter distance and tends to be within countries, which we saw in our CWS study, but we also saw some examples like in Cambodia, because it was a border province, that people are moving into Thailand. So I think it's important to keep the cross-border protections on the radar screen. And there's examples of ways to deploy existing humanitarian visas, try to create top-ups to labor migration programs, especially where there's complementary protections for human rights in the workplace, so that the existing kinds of migration mechanisms that exist can be expanded and extended for people who are moving because of climate change, and also to look at whether there's new forms of protections or pathways that could be specific towards climate. It's a bit tricky because it's not always evident that somebody is moving specifically or primarily because of climate change impacts. It might be because of climate plus the economy, plus you have a sister-in-law somewhere, plus you were threatened by law enforcement. So I think that's part of the challenge, and one reason that many advocates are proposing to try to use the mechanisms that still exist. And just on your second question, Rajan, which is I think really a good one also, it's to some extent the impacts are being newly felt. In some places they're not being newly felt, they're just being newly covered in the media maybe, or maybe becoming more visible. But they're all things that governments have access to the climate projections that have existed. And so these are not things that whether at the municipal level or at the provincial level or national level, governments I think can anymore say we didn't see it coming. I think that's a question of whether governments are investing in connecting the information that's available to the kinds of forward planning that needs to be done. A couple countries that have invested a lot of time and energy in this are Bangladesh and the Netherlands, in part because these are both low-lying countries that have a lot of their people, a lot of their economy, a lot of their infrastructure near sea level, below sea level, threatened by the impacts of rising seas, and in Bangladesh also the impacts of storms that are increasingly intense and increasingly frequent. And so if you were to look at the kinds of investments in planning being done in those countries, they're way ahead of a lot of other countries, including those of us here in the United States, and maybe from what you're describing also in Canada. And that's something I think for just those of us wearing our hat as somewhat, if you participate in public life or you're impacted by climate change where you are, call on your elected officials and see what kind of planning they have in place. How far have they gotten with their preparations?
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's so helpful. And we'll turn now to a very important perspective in the discussion, and that's the youth perspective. And so many of displaced persons or undocumented persons are youth, and we also have the largest youth population in human history in relation to the larger global population. So it's my pleasure to introduce Serge Hunten, who is the climate change and migration focal point for the Major Group for Children and Youth. The Major Group for Children and Youth is one of 10 major groups in consultation with the United Nations. And Serge, just to give you a little background about him and his expertise and experience, he holds a master's degree in forced migration studies from Moi University in Kenya, and a master's degree in economics, and a bachelor's degree in statistics and econometrics from Benin. He is interested in migration and development, refugee economies and inclusion, and international development. He was recently a research assistant at the Center for Human Rights, Gender, and Migration at Washington University in St. Louis. And he is currently a climate change and migration focal point, as noted, at the Major Group for Children and Youth. He is also a researcher at ACT for Displaced. He is also a founder of the Innovation Hub for Migration Research. Without further ado, Serge, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, MK, that's a wonderful introduction. Yeah, I'm originally from Benin in West Africa, but currently based in Kenya. Yeah, as all the predecessors of this discussion said about so far, climate change, adaptation, forced displacement has a critical issue nowadays, especially when you talk about East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Where I'm based in Kenya, so there is a research that is going on. We've not started yet, but the survey is ongoing about how those who have been displaced in the Rift Valley region, about the lake level rising. And we all know that natural disasters, which include flooding, often impact societies, foods, and also floods that tend to have a catastrophic issue on people's life. So I will talk about the lake Baringo in Kenya that has been having a significant water level increase between 2012 and 2014. That result in catastrophic flooding that has overwhelmed surrounding villages. And we all know that recently in 2020, we have 3 lakes in that region, and those 3 lakes started, the water level started rising, and that caused a significant internal displaced persons. And we read that that's called the attention of both the scientific community and also the media about the question on how climatic condition can contribute to livelihoods, shock, and also forced displacement. You know, the Lake Baringo water level increase has been devastating since it causes destruction of home, infrastructure, the industry, the livelihoods, and sometimes death, and it forces people to move from the lake bank. And also, we realize that in 2020 alone, more than 5,000 people has been displaced because of the water level rising in that region. And also it has negatively impacted the hospital, the schools, the roads, and the hospitality infrastructure in that region. And also recently, an author, Maya, in 2020 conducted a research in that region, and they found out that the flooding eventually has led submerging of crops, economic destruction, and consequently mass migration of the lake bank family to higher grounds. That means what, when the lake took over their houses, all their clubs, even their lawns, they have been relocated to another places. And you know, the households and the family were displaced, leading to what? The social, the professional, and the economic constraints. Meaning what? They don't have, if they are farmers, that means their land has been taken over by the water. They are not able anymore able to farm, to get their income from farming. And also those who are in fishing industry, it's become a bit tricky for them to continue with their daily activities. Wow, you know, mitigation and adaptation measures are crucial coping mechanism. There is need to understand the impact of the catastrophe to the residents, to recommend a practical policy that can have reliable solution on their well-being. But it's a bit tricky. Understanding the impact of that catastrophic starts from a rigorous impact evaluation of the lake level rising on forced displaced person. Therefore, there is a huge gap, you know, in data for evidence-based policy recommendation. Nowadays, it's so rare to get climate and migration data that is accurate data to design a rigorous policy and implementation in that area in general in Kenya. You know, though there are evidence from, for instance, you can see video online or images that prove that the climate has negatively impacted those who are in that area. But there's a lack of data for research first, and also evidence-based policy recommendation. Moreover, you realize that children are dropped out from school because of school and classroom disappearing underwater. That means what? Climate change is affecting children and youth more than ever before. Another recent research conducted by Nzegia and Mugata in 2021, by using a qualitative analysis, they revealed that climate change affect women livelihood more than men in 4 ways. The first one is women exercise more strength in domestic tasks, children, family care, in the farm labor. Women also experience more time demands. The sources of water and firewood are getting more scarce, leading to women traveling long distances in a search for fetching water and firewood, as said it by the previous communicated speakers. I mean, it also reduces farm yield because they don't have time to give more attention to the production of the farm. Hence, it leads to inadequate food supplies. The effect of time and the strength demand on women is a contributory factor to women poor health and domestic conflict and gender-based violence. Yes. So the same result has been confirmed by your interview conducted from the IDPs. I mean, those who have been displaced in that area where there is the lake Baringo water level rising. And they confirmed that women are the major population that are facing the consequences of the lake level rising. They do not have proper shelter, even though they have been given relocation, or they have been relocated, but without giving a sustainable shelters. However, as a youth and from the youth forum, we would like to address or give some recommendation to policymakers. The first recommendation is they should assess the impact of the lake rising on forced displaced persons, forced displaced person life and livelihoods, so that they will know what is the lack or what is their needs in terms of livelihoods and in terms of shelters. They should also try to evaluate the impact of the lake level on children, on students, school attendance, and gender effects. They should try to determine the coping strategy, resilience, and adaptation of climate change to internally displaced persons. So these three will lead to an evidence-based policy recommendation, designs, and implementation for the well-being of possibly displaced person. On that, I will say thank you.
Thank you so much, Serge. And you mentioned something that hadn't come up yet in the discussion, and that was the effect that flooding can have, or families' relocation can have, on school dropouts. So if you take these issues with decreased opportunity for livelihood, if you said there is some issues in the fishing industry or people having their farms flooded, that also creates less employable opportunities for youth. And then you double that with them dropping out of school or relocating, and their school relocates or is flooded. That's a huge economic disadvantage for youth as they move into adulthood and don't have a place to apply even any appropriate schooling for their future. Can you speak a little bit more about some of the like examples or repercussions that you've seen for youth that might be around their livelihood opportunities as a result of some of these flooding issues in the Lake Bank region?
I don't know whether it's my internet that was freezing, but can you come again? Can you repeat the question?
I'll quickly just summarize it. You mentioned the unique point about schools and kids having to drop out of schools, and then you double that with the challenges around livelihood opportunities that are affected by the flooding. Can you give us a couple of examples of the challenges for youth and their economic empowerment in the Lake Bank region because of these changes to livelihood opportunities and school access?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. The first challenge is about, even though right now they have been relocated, the place where they have been relocated to is there is no school that's near. That means so they must, if they want to go to school, they must walk in long distance before attending school in another area, because the school that was near, or that's near to them, has been taken over by the water level. So now they need to walk in long distance before attending school, and that is another impact. Some of them, they just decided to stay at home because they cannot walk in long distance before going to school. In those areas, it's so rare to have for instance, public transport or have individual transport to take them to school. And that's one, now it's a big issue. It's a gap in terms of attending school. And now you know that of school attending is a future, especially from developing country. Without schooling, you cannot expect to have that of a great future that we are expecting. And also you can realize that for those youth, and when they realize that okay, the distance is too much, they just stay at home and they end up being like useless in the society, you know. So in brief, that's what I can say. That's the big challenge right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much. These are really important considerations. I want to pass it now to the audience if there are any burning questions that folks may have from all of our speakers, or even from some of the discussion that we've had with our fellow attendees. I'll give it a second or so to see if folks have anything they want to put in the chat. I want to also just remind our attendees, please take a moment to please place your name, your position, and your affiliation or organization and location in the chat. We like to know where everyone's coming from and who's joined us today. If you can type that into the chat box, that would be wonderful. So if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat box, and I'll give it a second. And in the meantime, I would like all of our speakers to also just consider, since we're coming up on the end of our time, I would like you to consider one tweet that you could say. What would be your tweet message that you would put as your closing remark? So instead of a long explanation, what would be your short Twitter announcement to attendees or for the public that you want to leave as your key message? So I'll give you each a moment to think about that, and I'll call on each of you as our closing remarks for that. Okay. If there are no particular additional questions from the audience, you know, I want to touch again on a note made in the beginning that when folks are relocating, whether it's because they're internally displaced or they have to actually move into another country, 75% of those persons are out of their home area for more than 5 years. And 4 out of 5 of those people are relocated in developing countries, whether that's internally or relocated to another or a developing country. And this means that, again, we have a huge challenge for people achieving their development goals. We've talked a lot today about the various challenges to reaching each of the SDGs, gaps that climate change can have on education and its access, gaps that it can have on water access, gaps in food security, issues for economic empowerment and livelihoods, sustainable use of the planet. There is a whole plethora of concerns around what climate change, climate adaptation, and displacement means for people getting the chance to achieve their SDGs. I don't know if any of the speakers have a final remark they'd like to make about that before we come to the tweets, but I wanted that to be a significant consideration for folks, especially because we only continue to see additional instances of displacement and movement for folks across the world in both the North and Southern hemispheres right now. So the issue of displacement, it's not getting any better, and climate change is only becoming worse. We know that the severity of instances of natural disasters continues to worsen, and the frequency is also a concern. So and Jean makes a great comment in the chat that the pandemic has also greatly impacted migrant refugees as well. And lest we not forget that. And I appreciate you reminding that to the group, Jean. That is incredibly true. With just a couple of minutes left, if there are no additional questions from the audience, Andrew, do you have just a tweet remark that you can make to summarize what you think the most important message needs to be from your end that we can leave with today?
Sure. Strong human rights for women and girls, including secure rights to land and natural resources, can reduce the threat of climate-induced displacement and increase safety in migration.
Awesome, love it. And also, she's still with us? Yes, you are. Swata, what would be your closing tweet remark for our audience today?
Yeah, so I don't know if it will fit 140 characters, but yeah, so I think we are in a time whereby we are looking at complex emergencies, and with the complexities of emergencies, we are talking about climate related or weather related. We're looking at the pandemic, so definitely looking at holistic approaches, integrated approaches that of course look at the aspects of including vulnerable populations like women and girls, elderly, and persons with disabilities during the preparations and yeah, the planning processes.
Thank you so much, Swata. And Serge, a tweet remark as well from you.
Okay, what I would like to say is the government should, or the policymakers should include the youths in their decision-making level. If they can also call youth on the table so that they can also participate in the decision-making in the policy design, implementation, and evaluation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Serge. Just some key points that I'll just close with, and then everyone is free to go. Oh, thank you, Andrew. Andrew has typed in his tweet into the chat box. If you want to see it as well, it is there.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I cheated a little bit because I recycled the tweet that we had used during COP26 last year.
And still relevant, right? To show that we need to stay on this, right? You know, the thing that came up, I think, with every speaker was community decision-making, people having access to decision-making, especially at the county and community levels, especially for women, especially for youth. The mental health repercussions of climate adaptation, whether that means they do have access to certain coping mechanisms, or they have to take on negative coping mechanisms, or they have certain GBV or other traumatic experiences in ending up in forced displacement. Also thinking about, again, the various SDGs that are affected by climate adaptation or lack thereof and forced displacement. And of course, lived experience and how that affects people's choice, whether that's household and domestic drudgery, time poverty, childcare, household care, land care. These are some of the big things that I think continually kept coming up with our speakers, and I want us to carry forward. And then lastly is to make sure that whatever recommendations we've heard today, if you're engaged in policy and advocacy work, please do carry some of these recommendations forward into what you advocate for, so that this is not just a discussion, but can have some lasting impact for policy change in your country or in your organization, and best practices or for foreign development assistance. I thank you all very much for your attention today, and for everyone joining us from various parts across the world. If you haven't yet, please again put your name, your position, your affiliation, and your location in the chat, and we will be sure to also circulate the recording to all registered attendees. I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.